Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. This is episode 41, The War of Giants, Part 1, The Kings of Shinar. And so today's episode and the next episode is going to focus on chapter 14 of Genesis, which I think is a very often overlooked and very important passage and set of events and information that is so key to understand the early post-Diluvian period and the beast kingdoms that are going to extend out of the kings of Shinar in terms of Assyria, in terms of Babylon, in terms of Persia. So we've got, several in there that are part of the seven empires that we need to understand in prophecy. So it's important to understand how this is coming about in the early post-Diluvian epoch. And in Genesis 14, Abraham has already moved from the city of Ur that we're going to mention a few times today in conjunctions with the kings of Shinar. And after escaping those kings, is settling in the land of Canaan with several people that have squatted the covenant land that we're going to talk about in part 2. And what's interesting about the land of Ur that Abraham came from is that this is the land of Nimrod. This is the land of Shinar that Nimrod stays in and founds or renovates many cities, including Arioch. And Arioch is the city that is transliterated into Hebrew as Uruk. And what's interesting about that is there's a good case that giants were at the time of Babel when Nimrod was king and before the disbursement of the people, and that's where he gained his reputation from fighting with giants. And in fact, if you look up in the Septuagint in the Nimrod version, it actually says he was fighting against the giants. So an interesting translation there that we don't get out of the Masoretic text. And what's also interesting about the city of Ur and Uruk is that you have a king Shulgi that is ruling from the city of Ur, and his brother is Gilgamesh of Uruk, just as you have these hero epics of the kings of Uruk that is very famous in Sumerian mythology. And of course, Gilgamesh was 11 cubits tall, so 16 to 19 feet, depending on how you're measuring that cubit. And he was 4 cubits wide, so 6 to 7 feet wide. So these are the giants that Nimrod is fighting with, and probably the reason he built Babel City. And of course, Nimrod is the one who's going to also intermarry into these dynasties after Babel in Shinar that are going to again align with the beast kingdoms coming out of the Mesopotamia region. And so Shulgi is king of the Ur the Third dynasty around 2100 to 2030 BC, and Gilgamesh is fifth after Utnapishtim. So certainly this is putting a time frame that is just after Nimrod, third generation, often equated with Enmerkar out of Sumeria, for a lot of reasons, which we won't go into today, but it's an interesting parallel account of Nimrod, I think, in the Sumerian mythology. And so Genesis 14 is going to take place circa 1980 to 1950 BC. So, again, a couple generations there, but there's a patronymic pattern that sort of happens with the kings that we're going to be touching on today. But I just want to sort of line up the history from a biblical chronology so that people have an understanding of what's going on. Because if you're looking at a secular chronology of the years, they're basically going to put Gilgamesh ruling at about 25 to 2600 BC. But from a biblical chronology, you understand how that's going to match up, and that's going to have a significant overlap into our understanding of who are the kings of Mesopotamia that are coming into war with the various peoples occupying the covenant land. So having put that all on the table, then let's look at the first king. And this is King Amraphel. And I find that you find a lot within a name, but we understand he's the king of Shinar. But historians actually will place him at as part of the the third dynasty. And so the city of that Shulgi is, brother of Gilgamesh and of Arioch, you can start to see where some of these relationships are starting to show a bloodline of giants as kings, within the third generation after the flood of the time of Nimrod, and fully entrenched and more powerful as we get into the times of Genesis 14. And so Amraphel is the Hebrew word from 569, meaning the sayer of darkness. And he's the son of Shulgi, as we understand the king's list coming down from Sumeria. And Amraphel has basically a compound word. So we need to understand how that word breaks down. And the first part is AM. And AM means people, 5971 in Hebrew. So it's describing a people within the patronymic name. And Amraphel has a root back coming, according to the Strong's Concordance, back to Amar, 559, which means proud, boastful, arrogant speaker. And again, a description of a Rephaim or a Nephilim who were said to be very proud, very hubris, and because of their strength and their demigod status. And Amar is the root for Amorite or Amori, number 567. So you have a series of words, and the Amorites are a people in the land of the covenant and on east of the Jordan. And as we're going to learn, a people in Mesopotamia as well. Very, very important people in Mesopotamia. So we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. The middle word is Raph. And Raph goes back to the Hebrew word Rapha, and Rephaim plural. And noting that the Rephaim are the people also mentioned in Genesis 14 that are some of the people that the kings are fighting against. And that the word Rephaim, it also connects you to King Og and King Sihon of the Mount Hermon region, who are the last of the giants, with the giants being that word Rapha. And so Rapha can mean three different words. It's rooted in a meaning called healer that a lot of people go to first. And I think that meaning is deriving from the Rephaim because you had to kill them by taking their head. So I think there was a self-healing quality that they had, that if you didn't take their head off, that they wouldn't remain dead. They had some sort of immune system, and I think that's sort of the root where it is. But it also can be used for healer and physician as well within the Bible. So you have to look at the context where they're using the separate root word of 77495 for healer or physician. And it can also mean a ghost or a shay, a spirit. But typically we understand it as for a tribe of giants, just as it's used for giant, I think 25 times in the Old Testament. And so now we have another key piece to the name. And then the last part is El, 4:10, which is a singular form of Elohim, for God Almighty, capitalized, and for multiple gods, or as in plural, for many gods, let's say like the Baalim that ruled from Mount Hermon. And so we have a connection here to gods, and or El can mean mighty or strong and mighty one. So again, you have to understand the application that you're going to put this in. But if we put this together, we get a name of coming from Amraphel that means something like a giant people of God, or a giant people that were mighty ones of a god. I mean, it all depends on how you want to put those meanings together. And this was proud speaking people. So I think there's a definite connection within the name that identifies that this is a bloodline of Rephaim kings in the time of Genesis 14 that were in charge of the third dynasty, which is also kind of important to understand the context, and that dynasty was quite powerful, and that it's marked by the days of Amraphel because he's of the third dynasty, as opposed to Chedorlaomer, who we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So I just wanted to put that in perspective because it starts to make sense of what's going on here, I think. And so when we look at the Amorites as how there might be connected in there, is that the Amorites are also known in Egypt as Amar, A-M-A-R of that time. They were also known in Sumeria as the Amaru, A-M-U-R-R-U, as it's transliterated into English. And that they were called the Amaru people, but they also worshipped an Amaru god. And this Amaru god is actually mentioned in the Ugaritic texts. So he's part of the Baalim that is mentioned. A lot of people, historians will say that Amaru is the same as the god Adad and Hadad, which is the same god as Baal, but the Ugaritic texts actually have a separate name for this god as part of the Baalim. And that's important to understand because the Amorites are a patriarchalist nation in Genesis 10. And only the patriarchalist nations of the Canaanite tribes, the 9, as opposed to Canaan, Sidon, and Heth, who have patriarchal names as the sons of Canaan, these other ones do not have names, including the Amorites. And that's because Rephaim are not listed as patriarchs in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 or 1 Chronicles, just as Arba, the father of Anak, is not listed in the Table of Nations, just as Rapha for Rephaim, which is likely a name of a patriarchal giant named Rapha or something similar to that, who are responsible for the Rephaim that are described in Genesis 14 as a separate people from the Amorites and other people of the covenant land. And so once we start to understand this, and we understand that Og and Sihon were the last of the Rephaim, certainly Og was, and there's a lot of people who believe that Sihon was his brother. If not, he's certainly connected and part of that empire of Mount Hermon that Moses and Joshua destroyed in the time of the Exodus. And so we get from this that Amaru is the god, and Amor is the root for the Amori or the Amorites, which are the hybrid humans that intermarry with the sons of Canaan or the daughters of Canaan, Sidon, and Heth to form all of these patriarch nations. So Amar might be, and likely is, I think, is the patriarchal giant's name, probably produced from Amaru god with another human female after the flood, perhaps before the flood, but in my sort of understanding of the Bible, it would be a post-diluvian recreation. And that Amar would be the patriarch for the Amorites, which now starts to make sense from a patriarchal bloodline, that you're going to have kings that are going to descend through the bloodlines and into the later generations. So we get in, and where I'm going with that is if you look at the incredible famous Code of Hammurabi, who ruled 1792 to 1750, in that range. That's a few more generations down from the time of Amraphel, but it's got a lot of connections to Amraphel. So typically that H is going to be silent, but typically also in the spellings we're going to get Hamar, Abi. But it also, you'll get variations of that as being spelled with a P. So Hamar Rapi, as in the Rapium or the Raphaim, that's out of the Ugaritic text, where Amaru is also connected in. And when you look at later kings out of the Ugaritic text, in fact, in somewhere between 1250 and 1180 BC, we get an Amraphel that's actually spelled Murapi as a patronymic king. So Hammurabi is part of that patronymic kings that are ruling Amorites and Amorite-run empires throughout history, at least up until, let's say 1000 BC. And what's interesting is Hammurabi's kingdom is recognized as an Amorite kingship. So the Amorites get so powerful that they actually are controlling a Mesopotamian kingship of Babylon. And again, most people don't make those kind of connections, but it's important to understand what's going on in the times of Abraham moving into Genesis 14, A, from where he moved from, and then B, to the people he has moved in, and then his involvement in this war of giants. So it's really rich in the details once you start to dig into it. But if it was just Amraphel as being connected to giants, then you would say, well, okay, fine, but we don't really have much to tell us about the giants out of Mesopotamia. But we actually do, and it's in the details again. And so Arioch is the next king I'm going to talk about. And this one's really interesting and some very good connections for people that they might enjoy. And he's the king of Elasar. And Arioch is Hebrew 746. And you're not going to not believe this, but if you look it up, it actually says, and it has a meaning of lion-like. Just as you have these Nephilim or Rephaim kind of beings after the flood that is recorded biblically in 2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11 as a couple examples of the lion-like men of Moab. And you couldn't get a more obvious connection to these warrior-like Nephilim creatures, and now we have a king of Elasar with that name Arioch. And what's interesting about that is we also have, the lion-like men of, or the lion-faced men of Gad. And here's where that kind of intersects. So lion-like, as you take that out of the lion-like men of Moab, comes from Ariel. That's number 739, and Arioch was 746. So it's related in the group of the words. And 739 Ariel has a root of number 738, which is Eri. And it is also that word that is being used for lion faces in the lion men or the lion-faced people of Gad. And what's also interesting is you have 740, which is part of this group of words, which is Ariel, which means lion of God, which is thought to be, in a lot of occult beliefs, to be an angel, one of the fallen angels that would have been a lion-like God who produced lion-like offspring. And what's also interesting about the A-R-I of Ariel or Arioch or Ariel is that is the root word for the Aryans. and the Aryans that became the Persians. And so you're going to get some versions of those names that I'm not going to go into today that are part of the Bible in the time of the Persian Empire. And again, understand that patronymic in terms of names coming down, things start to make a little bit more sense. And in 2 Kings 17:30, we actually get a god named Nergal. And Nergal is the god of Cuth. And it was a popular god in the third dynasty. So at the time of Arioch, at the time of Amraphel. And this Nergal god is associated with these warrior-like Nephilim beings called the Irma Hulu or the Ulalulu. I think I got that wrong. Ulalu, which were ruthless warriors of Nergal. And that's who I think Arioch comes from that kind of bloodline based on the names. So it's very important to understand these concepts as we understand these kings, and those are the first two. So let's move now on to King Tidal. And King Tidal derives from the Hebrew word 1763, tishal, meaning terrible, fear, or make afraid, just as people were terrified by the Rephaim. They were called the terrible ones in Ezekiel 32 and in Isaiah 14 and other Isaiah 25. These are the terrible ones who reaped terror on the earth. These are the ones who were slain that are in the prisons along the sides of the abyss for creating that terror on the earth. These are the Rephaim kings that Pharaoh is talking to, communicating with, at least in a prophetic allegorical sense. Whether or not that's real or not, I'll leave that up to you, but they're communicating from the abyss with the Pharaoh, who's also part of the beast bloodlines and part of the 7 empires, at least the original Egyptian empire. And so Tidal is king of nations, which is an odd term, king of nations. So he's an important king. We're just not really told biblically where he comes from. But what's interesting is that they're thought to be the Hurrians. And the Hurrians are thought to be the Horim of that we'll talk about in the next chapter on this, and that the Hurrians intermixed with the Marianu and the Aryans to form the Mitanni dynasty and the Hittite dynasty, which has a connection into the Hittites in terms of how they become giant-like and the intermarriages going on there. And when we look at Tidal in terms of not the root word that we talked about in 1763, but 884:13 Tidal, as we get that out of Strong's, that means great son and chief of nations. And a great son is a hero, god, demigod son, and Rephaim is typically how that it would be understood. And what's also interesting is that in the Greek transliteration of Tidal, and I think you can see that in the Septuagint as well, is Targal. And Gal at the end, it means in Sumerian big, mighty, and great, and hero-like. And typically a name that was applied to the king heroes of Uruk and surrounding cities. And the name for king in Sumerian was Lugal because there were giant men. Just as Shulgi probably has a variation of that Gal in his name. So interesting that all of these names sort of cross kind of paths as they come down through the etymological ladders through history. And what's also interesting is that there was a king amongst the Anakim in the Promised Land called Talmai, along with Sheshai and Ahiman. And Talmai is a Hurrian or a Horim word. And Talmai in Hurrian is the word Telma, which means giant. Which now you have a crossover with the Anakim kings with using some of the names and the meanings, meaning that they're all sort of interconnected, and it all makes sense when you start to piece together all of these nations. And so this is King Tidal, king of the Hurrian nations, that's associated with the Aryans that will eventually produce the Persian kings of the beast empires that's talked about in Daniel. So understanding these roots is just extraordinarily important. Hoping I didn't disconnect my mic here. Nope, I didn't. Sorry about that. And so we're going to move now on to the last king, because I'm running a little bit short of time for the show here. So to keep it moving, let's talk about Chedorlaomer. And he was known as the Ravager of the West. And he's the king of Elam. And everybody thinks he's leading this war of giants, but he's actually in history known as a vassal king of the III Empire, who is their tax collector. So when in Genesis 14, the Canaanite kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and region refused to pay the tribute, that's when Chedorlaomer goes to Amraphel of the III dynasty and says, hey, look, they're not paying this tribute, so they're going to go in and punish the Sodomites in the war of 4 kings against 5, as it's sometimes called, but the war of giants, because there's giants on both sides, and that's kind of the point of what we're talking about here. It was a Rephaim or a Nephilim world order very early on, and so he's the king of Elam, Chedorlaomer. And Legomar, in several different translations, is the god of Elam. And Elam is one of those Rephaim kings that is being talked about in Ezekiel 32, who's in the abyss, along with some other interesting names if you want to read through that chapter. But Legomar is the Elamite god. And so when we're understanding who these kings are, understand that the opening verse describes it in the time of Amraphel, because it was of the III dynasty, which gives you the dates that you need to have. And now this fits in where Chedorlaomer actually fits in terms of the order. So he's a king, and he is, and Chedor actually means king, as you break that name down. And so he's the king for the god of Elam, Legomar. So it's indicating again that typically the kings are the offspring of the gods, and we're looking for possibly a people and names that are going to be associated with Chedorlaomer if we were wanting to trace his lineage back into what god. But certainly Legomar was the god of Elam, so one would think he would be from there. But what's also interesting is that in Genesis 15, which just follows the Genesis 14 war, and this is the time when Abraham is going to be promised the land from the Nile to the Euphrates, and where these giant kings were talked about that we're talking about today of Shinar, you get the people called the Cadmonites. And that's the Cadmoni. And it's defined as Easterners. And it's rooted in 6924, Kedem, which means east, and ancient Eastern Aboriginals. So that can mean before the flood, or it can mean right from the flood, but older and the first ones there. And so when we think about Noah and all of the tribes coming down of the Noahites from the mountain and settling in Shinar, the giants would have been there by this sort of translation as the ancient Eastern Aboriginals, the Kedem, that are somehow connected to the Cadmoni, the Cadmonites, who are not in the Table of Nations either, and are likely Rephaim, or some kind of offspring of the gods and human females. Similar to Arioch as an example when I say something like that. So we get a term called the people of the East in Genesis 29:1. But where we really sort of close in on it is in Judges 6, in Judges 7 and 8, with the people that are aligned with the Amalekites and the Midianites who are warring with the Israelites, and understanding the Amalekites are hybrids as well, as I cover off in my book. And there's also a race of Amalekim that's covered off in Genesis 14. And when we look at what they're called the children of the east, or the Ben Kadam, from which the Cadmonites come from. And understand that the area that is being promised to Abraham goes to the Euphrates, from the people of the east, and I would say the giants of the east. And so everything that we look at in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15 in terms of peoples, and there are other peoples in Genesis 15 we don't have time to cover today, that are amongst the mighty seven, and including the Rephaim and the Perizim and the Kenizzites and the Kenites. And we've got a number of nations not on the table of nations that people need to explore and learn more about. But for today, understand that the kings that Nimrod married into that produced the Mesopotamian beast empires were Rephaim, or some kind of offspring of fallen angels and human females. And if you want some more information on this, you can get a hold of me through my website at thegenesis6conspiracy.com. And I've got the two-part series that I'm going to be presenting on a document that I can send you. So get a hold of me through my website, thegenesis6conspiracy.com. And until next time, may God bless you all abundantly. And hopefully we've raised a little bit of curiosity with you today. Thank you until next time.